Would the potential salvager have to pay the company an insurance upfront or only after the salvaging is complete?
Typically after. But it would just generally provide the legal framework, and then the contracts would be specific on those kind of points. The other ocean-going salvage has two types of circumstances for salvage. One is contract salvage, and the other is salvage in emergency circumstances. And in emergency circumstances, in ocean-going salvage, if a ship is in danger of sinking, if all the crew and passengers have gotten off of the ship safely, then a salvage company can come in, and if they rescue the cargo, they get a pretty high payout in terms of percentage of the value of that cargo, and the rest of the value goes typically to the insurance company. But they also, another part of ocean-going salvage in emergency situations, if more than one ship respond to a ship in distress, if one ship rescues the crew and passengers and another ship rescues the cargo, the ship that rescues the crew and passengers gets a share of the monetary value of the cargo to pay them back for being good Samaritans. And so we would do exactly the same thing for outer space. And so it would also provide an incentive for rescue of people that are in danger of losing their lives, or companies that are in danger of losing cargo. So it has a lot of incentives for good deeds, and also to support a new industry of commercial salvage. So that's the salvage part of it. The real property rights, again, I'd like to talk about a little bit of the philosophy behind it. There are 5 UN treaties on outer space, and the United States is party to 4 of them. The common names for them are the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Liability Convention, the Rescue and Return of Astronauts Treaty, and the 5th one is the Moon Treaty. The United States is a party to all of these treaties except for the Moon Treaty. The Moon Treaty is controversial. It opened for signature in 1979, and it prohibits real property rights in outer space. And it would establish an international resource regime that would control resource appropriation in outer space. And it has a term in there, it says that there will be equitable sharing, but it doesn't say equitable sharing of what. And so the assumption is that would include taxation, that mining companies who mine in outer space would have to pay a percentage of their profits to this International Regime Authority. And the International Regime Authority would have to approve any mining activities ahead of time and give them a license. This has never been acceptable to the United States, and so we've never signed or ratified the treaty. Part of the difficulty with the treaty, and with all of the same circumstances affect all of the UN treaties, and that is that the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that's the group where these treaties were negotiated, they operate on the basis of consensus. And so every nation that's part of that committee has to agree to every word in the treaty. As a result, the treaties don't have any definitions of their terms, and they tend to make very general statements of principle. With respect to the first 4 treaties that we are a party to, they are general statements of principles, but they're principles that we agree with. And for the most part, I think the majority opinion is that those are pretty good treaties. The Moon Treaty, however, has these specific provisions that require this resource regime and the licensing regime for mining. And even though the U.S. negotiated the treaty after it came out and was thoroughly discussed, it was clear it wasn't going to go through the Senate, and it's never been signed. So the treaty does have, I believe, 14 parties now. The UN website, believe it or not, is not up to date, and so I can't be sure about how many parties have, how many nations are party to the treaty. I read in an article 17, but I don't know where the author of that article got 17. But you can see the Outer Space Treaty has 100 parties, and the Moon Treaty has somewhere in the teens. So the Outer Space Treaty in Article 2 has a prohibition of territorial sovereignty. And many space lawyers in the past have argued that that would prohibit any form of property rights. I looked at that very closely, and it's a very complicated issue. But to boil it down for the layman and say it in layman's terms, sovereignty is like a bundle of rights that nations are entitled to under international law. Part of that is a nation has a right to exercise authority over its territory. Within the boundaries of their territory, the national governments can pass laws, and their courts can adjudicate disputes, and so they control what goes on in that area. Another part of that bundle of rights is what we call jurisdiction, which is the authority to take action, and that can include passing laws and adjudicating disputes and that sort of thing. So the Outer Space Treaty allows nations to have all the rights that they have, except that they can't exercise authority over territory. That does mean that you can't have traditional property rights, because traditional property rights relate to a piece of territory, and they are permanent. Property rights based on territorial sovereignty are permanent. So I looked at the treaty and I said, well, can we have some form of property rights that's not based on territorial sovereignty? And so I, through my analysis, determined that you can have a form of property rights it's identical to property rights that we have on Earth, except they're not permanent. And so they're based on jurisdiction rather than on territorial sovereignty. So pursuant to the Outer Space Treaty, the United States and other nations that are party to the treaty, they have authority over space objects and their citizens while they're in outer space. So if a private company or an individual puts a facility on the moon, for example, a residence, then as long as that residence is there, then the United States has jurisdiction over that area. And as long as the people are there, the United States has jurisdiction over those people.